Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Class 30, the last class for this week on fossil fuel divestment. And let's go ahead and jump right in. Today, we're going to be looking at ways in which the fossil fuel divestment movement, especially fossil fuel divestment activism on college campuses, can help us think about the different principles of responsibility that we've been talking about in the past few weeks in more concrete terms and more and in a sphere that excuse me, hopefully all of you can easily relate to. So we're going to talk about the general idea behind fossil fuel divestment, and then over the course, in the last part of the lecture, as well as in your discussion threads, we're going to think about which kind of principles of justice and responsibility might be motivating and what might be being demonstrated by these efforts. So here, what is fossil fuel divestment? We're going to start with a short video here on the top that kind of introduce these ideas.
Mainly in the US at the moment, and it's a new way into the whole climate debate that is a bit different from, changing light bulbs.
Divestment is a very simple idea. You just take your money away from companies that are involved in extracting fossil fuels.
You want your money to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Divestment is the biggest signal which any individual or company can give to the fossil fuel industry.
If you want to do something about climate change, you want those fossil fuel companies to stop burning the reserves they've got, and you want them to behave differently. You do that by refusing to buy their shares.
Divestment says we do not accept your premise, we do not like what you're doing.
And in practical terms, it's about moving your money away from the problem and towards the solution.
I don't know about you, but I don't really have any shares. But we all have stakes in pension funds and various forms of investment through our lives. And those investments will almost certainly include shares in fossil fuel companies.
A generation ago, when the biggest moral issue in the world was apartheid in South Africa, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu suggested this tactic, that it was time for the great institutions of the West to cut their economic ties with companies that propped up the apartheid regime. If there's ever going to be any kind of international agreement, it'll only be because our political and business leaders are feeling unrelenting pressure from all over the world.
So unless there's political pressure to change, nothing will change.
It's very useful for shaming companies. It's very useful for bringing the issue out into the open more.
It provides a really powerful moral framework.
This is not a normal movement. There are no great leaders. There's no Dr. King climate movement. Fossil fuel industry is sprawling. It's protean. And so the resistance to it needs to be the same way.
But that's the exciting part. The change isn't a technological change. It's not scientific change. It is now social change.
We should be tackling fossil fuel companies directly. Leave it
in the ground.
So as that video suggests, the main idea behind fossil fuel divestment is to withdraw one's financial investments from companies that profit from either fossil fuel companies directly or companies that benefit from the fossil fuel industry. And this was a strategy that was popularized by Bill McKibben of 350.org in the mid-2010s with a way of politicizing individual consumption choices as a way to move away from climate action away from reducing one's own carbon footprint and doing something in addition to trying to lobby elected officials or protest or demonstrate, but as a way to kind of put pressure on fossil fuel companies themselves, and as he talks about in this interview here.
The divestment thing has been a remarkable ride, one that we didn't quite expect when we started it 5 or 6 years ago. It sort of spurred on by memories of the fight against apartheid. And in fact, it was Desmond Tutu was one of the early people saying, do this, take this tool again. It's now much larger than that. I think yesterday there was a press conference where the total was $6.24 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have now divested in part or in whole. And what began with small colleges in the corners of this country, it's now New York City, it's now London. New York City, the mayors of New York and London yesterday challenged all the other mayors in the world to divest their pension funds. The country of Ireland, the whole country of Ireland, divested its holdings in fossil fuels last month. So it's become an extraordinary tool to try and take on the power that we were talking about before. Money is the oxygen on which the fire that is global warming burns. And if we are able to stamp out that supply of money, then that fire will begin to dwindle. And divestment is a huge part of that, and it's extremely exciting.
So you might be thinking to yourself, I don't own stocks or bonds. I'm not an investor. But what part of what the divestment movement has been trying to emphasize is the ways in which we are connected to the financing of fossil fuel extraction through various institutions and organizations that we already participate in. So the fossil fuel divestment movement also is not just targeting individuals and individual portfolios, but the ways in which our universities, our colleges and universities endowments are invested in, and they're invested in fossil fuel corporations, what different employers, different employers and corporations, as well as foundations, and in our own retirement accounts, pension funds that people have, whether they're through their corporation, their employers, whether they are through state, local, and federal governments, to try to target these larger actors to divest from fossil fuel companies and to invest their endowments in more sustainable energy. And there's both a moral and an economic argument being made here. And the moral argument is obviously that and we'll talk about these in a second, that you should not profit off of global warming and climate change. But the economic argument is trying to suggest that, like, look, if the fight against climate change is going to be successful, and if your portfolios are heavily invested in fossil fuel companies, your portfolios are going to take a hit. So it's trying to appeal on both moral and kind of self-interested grounds to these different institutions. So what is the point of a divestment campaign and divestment activism? The obvious one is that the goal is to, as McKibben said in that interview, to create financial costs to fossil fuel corporations, to starve the fossil fuel industry of finance. However, pretty much most activists, and we'll see some quotes from activists in a little bit later in this lecture, and most analysts have basically found that, like, the measures that have been successful are in no way affecting the bottom line of fossil fuel companies. The demand for cheap and reliable energy that is provided by fossil fuels is so great that these divestment efforts, on even large-scale ones, are not going to be able to effectively starve fossil fuel corporations from the money that they need to continue extraction. So the question then becomes, what are the other ways goals? And this kind of, if we can recall Jameson's argument about moving away from calculating possible outcomes. As your reading from Healy and Berry suggests, that part of what it's doing is it's politicizing the full life cycle of carbon. That it's not just talking about the consumer end of what we should do to reduce carbon footprint, but it's saying we also need to stop extracting fossil fuels from the ground, this idea of keep it in the ground. And part of what divestment is trying to do is it's trying to say that, look, carbon emissions aren't just a function of where they are emitted. It's not just when we burn the coal, or when we produce that electricity or drive the car. That there's an entire life cycle and an entire political economy around how fossil fuel companies finance fossil fuel extraction. And it's to think about the broader ways that we are connected economically and financially to fossil fuel extraction and how our own lives are profiting indirectly through these financial networks from the extraction of and burning of fossil fuels. So it's trying to politicize our kind of unthinking connection to the fossil fuel industry. Second is that you probably heard of this language of denying the social license to operate. That part of what it's trying to do is to get by withdrawing financial support for fossil fuels, the goal is to delegitimize their extraction and these corporations, and saying that you do not have the authority, or it is not legitimate what you are doing, and you do not have our support. That it's withdrawing a form of tacit support or consent to the fossil fuel industry by saying we are not going to be participants and complicit in this anymore. And as Healy and Berry note, it also reorients discourse, that it's moving away from a kind of economic, privatized conception of fossil fuel use or of carbon footprints to turning the climate and energy question into a question of complicity and of collective action and of of social legitimacy. As Healy and Berry note, that it is inserting politics and ethics and conflict into the energy life cycle, into discussions of energy use and into energy consumption and production, in a way that it's forcing the questioning of the kind of background reliance on fossil fuels, and forcing those questions politicizes and reorients that discourse. So where fossil fuel divestment FFD movements have been most successful is on college campuses. And in 2011, the first major college campus effort started at Swarthmore College with the Swarthmore Mountain Group as an attempt to divest the college in Pennsylvania from coal companies. And this spread throughout colleges, especially liberal arts colleges in the Atlantic and Northeast, and then on the West Coast, especially through the creation of the Divestment Student Network, which worked to connect student activists at different college campuses to help them share resources and put pressure on their administrations and their chief financial officers and their treasurers to divest. And in many of these cases, these FFD movements have been either entirely or majority student-driven, that these are efforts being made by students to challenge the ways in which their universities and colleges are financing their endowments and paying and financing and investing in the pensions of their workers. And so these are bottom-up struggles at these colleges and universities. As Healy and Berry note, between 2011 and 2017, the fossil fuel divestment movement has prompted over 732 institutional commitments and over 58,000 individual commitments to divest a fossil fuel sector across 76 countries. And in the Grady-Benson and Sarathy article, and this article is a few years old, so this is not like the most updated, but you can see here that some of the successes that the fossil fuel divestment movement has had on college campuses, including some very large endowments of tens of millions of dollars in their endowments, divesting from fossil fuels. And so some of these colleges and universities are relatively small as compared to some larger universities. Many of these are liberal arts colleges or are smaller state colleges or community colleges. You can see that the language that they're using in their divestment, right, that there's the language of social environmental responsibility, alignment with values. This alignment with values is often cited, but also this idea about long-term endowment stability, that they are thinking long-term about what would happen or how might decarbonization affect their endowment. So again, it's both these moral and these self-interested motivations being at work here. And more recently, one of the most successful fossil fuel divestment and one of the largest divestment efforts happened in the University of California system. Fossil Free UC has been organizing and pressuring the UC system to divest since 2012. So this has been a 7-year process that they announced in the fall of 2019 that the UC system was divesting from any fossil fuel holdings from its $13.4 billion endowment and $70 million pension fund. This represents the largest college higher institution of higher education to engage in divestment efforts, but it's also very symbolic given the size and prestige of the University of California's system to divest. And many people have found that this was a very hopeful sign that if the University of California can do it with its $13.4 billion endowment, that other colleges and universities could follow suit, and that could really start changing the social legitimation of fossil fuel investments. But of course, there's intense debate over the actual meaning of this. For example, in an opinion piece published by the Los Angeles Times by the UC's Chief Investment Officer and the Chairman of the UC Board of Regents Investments Committee, Jagdeep Singh Bakhar and Richard Sherman argue that their job was to maintain the strength of the endowment. They write, "We are investors and fiduciaries for what is widely considered the best public research university in the world. This makes us fiscally conservative by nature and by policy. Risk rules is one of the 10 pillars of what we call the UC Investments Way. We want to ensure that the more than 320,000 people currently receiving the UC pension actually get paid and that we continue to fund research and scholarships. We believe that hanging on to fossil fuel assets is a financial risk. That's why we will have made our $13.4 billion endowment fossil free as of the end of this month, and why our $70 billion pension will also be this way. The risk-averse reasoning may not jibe with what you will read in a newspaper headline or scroll through the news feed on your phone. Some might see our action as born of political pressure or a green movement idealism, or perhaps political correctness run amok. So be it. We are part of a university system where diversity of opinion thrives." So they're kind of pushing back they're really emphasizing that this was a self-interested claim about the economic viability of continued investment in fossil fuel corporations. But in response to this posting, the Fossil Free UC released a statement, and they write that this isn't about bankrupting oil companies or even undermining their bottom line in the short term, that this main goal is about turning the tide of public opinion. And the goal is to reduce the power of the fossil fuel companies to control the public discourse and political process, and at the same time protect the value of endowment investments. That the goal here is less about what the actual financial bottom line here, but it's for fossil fuel divestment activists, the goal is about changing the way that we think about what is acceptable and what people are responsible for and complicit in. That it's changing the way we think about our relationship to fossil fuel extraction. And so there's kind of the meaning of the UC's divestment is contested, and of course. The UC is trying to kind of portray it in a way that it is that this is not kind of becoming beholden to student pressure, but is entirely a financial decision. And only time will kind of bear that out in terms of the long-term viability of fossil fuel portfolios. So where have fossil fuel movements been successful? As Grady-Benson and Sarathy note in their article, that largely these movements have been successful at smaller colleges and universities. The UC system is the glaring exception, and institutions with smaller endowments. But one of the biggest things that is predictive of universities divesting is pre-existing strong commitments to sustainability and social justice. Especially liberal arts colleges with strong commitments to value statements about sustainability, about social justice, about the social responsibility. That these are the institutions that are going to be more susceptible to claims about hypocrisy and fossil fuel divestment in the name of in moral and political language of justice and responsibility. And so they tend to be the most where movements have had the most success. And also they argue that they find that there are institutions where there's pre-existing kind of forms of collaboration between students and administration. And again, this is going to favor largely smaller colleges and universities, not large public research institutions in which there are just the institutions are so big, they're going to be more conservative because they're just harder to steer a ship that size. These smaller colleges and universities that already have these forms of almost shared governance, but not quite shared governance, there's going to be more susceptibility. So how should we think about fossil fuel divestment in terms of political responsibility? The reason why I assigned the Grady-Benson piece and Sarathy piece is because it includes significant interview and survey responses from fossil fuel divestment activists on various college campuses, including from Occidental College. So this first interview response from Lila Singer Burke Fossil fuel divestment addresses climate change on a systematic level. It is about collective climate action that targets the politics related to climate change. And so you can see here that this language that Singer-Burke is using is not about individual responsibility. It's not about it's not really about kind of doing one's own part to reduce their carbon footprint, but it's about looking at climate change at a systematic level, thinking about how we are interconnected with fossil fuels in ways we might not be aware. The other motivations that they find are the idea of collective action, that it's not just about individual action, but the fossil fuel divestment movement gives us is empowering this feeling of collective action. For example, a sophomore from Mount Holyoke College wrote, I honestly believe through organizing we can harness the immense power we have as conscientious and passionate citizens of the world. And another co-founder of the Claremont College's divestment campaign said, to start a movement, to ignite a fire, to inspire and come together. And this kind of collective and affirmative language, it's not a language about kind of guilt, it's not a language about debt, it's not a language about individual action, it's about collective political mobilization. And this gets it brought home in this statement from Stephen O'Hanlon, a Swarthmore student organizer. The impact of divestment movements past and present has little to do with the stocks themselves. Rather, it seeks to stigmatize firms, which causes indirect economic consequences. In the case of fossil fuel divestment, our goal is not to hurt share prices, but to erode the fossil fuel industry's social license. By doing so, the movement counteracts the distortions of our political system by the fossil fuel industry's injection of billions of dollars into our democracy, industry funding of climate denialism, and lobbying efforts to maintain fossil fuel subsidies and prevent the transition to a just and sustainable future we need. That the goals are not about thinking that divestment efforts are going to directly lead to emissions reductions, but the divestment campaigns are part of a broader political strategy for decarbonization. That divestment campaigns are ways that civil society actors can change the terrain of political discourse and political possibility around what is possible to counteract the immense influence that the fossil fuel industry has on political processes. But this is really about kind of reframing the political debate and the political questions, not about the direct emissions impacts of divestment efforts. And it's this kind of political imaginary that Healy and Barry focus on in their article about energy justice and divestment, that we have to think about the ways in which social energy systems, they write, shape, enable, and constrain the basic structure of our lives. That we are kind of our lives are so energy dependent, especially in the global north and in Western Europe and North America, that we are kind of isolated from the sources of extraction. We don't necessarily think about where our energy comes from. We just turn a switch on. That the fossil fuel divestment efforts focuses on changing the way we think about that, and is part of a struggle for energy justice, to think about how is our energy being produced, who is profiting from the production of energy, and who is suffering from the production of energy. So it's about shifting the kind of political possibilities that can emerge by kind of politicizing these background assumptions and shifting away from a kind of all or nothing decarbonization effort to how can we transition in a just way to more sustainable energy. So next week we're going to be looking at questions of rhetoric and persuasion. So we're going to be looking at rhetorical attempts to motivate climate action. We're going to look at ways in which religious leaders and religious groups have tried to address climate change. We're also going to be looking at indigenous rhetoric around climate change, and thinking about different types of rhetorical and cultural and value-based appeals beyond kind of the ones from standard philosophy, to think kind of broaden and pluralize our conception of what climate justice might mean, and how these different ways of articulating climate justice may have rhetorical appeal for different people. So we're going to be talking about rhetoric on Monday before we turn to these more specific examples throughout the week. And for your discussion threads, looking back at the accounts of fossil fuel divestment from the readings, and specifically the quotes from activists in the Grady-Benson and Sarathy piece, which principles of responsibility do you think is motivating and being realized by fossil fuel divestment activism? And so by these, I mean anything from the polluter pays principle all the way through Jameson's discussion of virtue ethics and McGregor's green citizenship. Like, how do you think, based on how they articulate their reasoning and the ways that the authors write about fossil fuel divestment, how do you think that they are understanding responsibility and climate justice? And does that matter for the way that we should think about it theoretically? As a reminder, the 200-word posts to any of the prompts for this week are due by Friday at midnight, and then by Sunday at midnight you should respond with a 100-ish word reply to one of your peers' posts, and it can be of any of the and on any of the discussion threads. It doesn't have to be the same one that you posted on. So that is going to wrap things up for us this morning, afternoon, whatever time you're watching this. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Stop into office hours or the discussion section, and we can talk about these in more detail. If you're having any accessibility issues, or if you are having any issues completing the assignments, please let me know. Please reach out to me, and we can make a fair and equitable resolution and accommodations for that. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, keep practicing social distancing, and take care of each other. Until next time, take care.